The Montana sun sat heavy and relentless over the open grasslands, burning the horizon into a pale, shimmering gold. It stretched all the way from the distant blue ridge of the mountains to the rolling hills where cattle moved like slow, dark clouds across the land. Dust lifted off the dry earth and drifted through the warm air like ash from a forgotten fire. Ranch hands hollered to one another across the fields. Horses stamped and snorted. The whole world outside was breathing, moving, full of life and noise and purpose. And inside the grand Calloway estate, a girl knelt alone on the ballroom floor, scrubbing. Her name was Sera Laine, and the only sound she made was the quiet, rhythmic drag of her brush against the polished wood. Her hands had stopped hurting weeks ago. That was the saddest part. Not that they ached, not that the skin had cracked and healed and cracked again, but that she no longer noticed. 6 months of hauling water buckets from the well, polishing silverware until her reflection stared back at her with hollow eyes, and scrubbing floors until the grain of the wood gleamed like warm honey in the afternoon light. 6 months of that had taught her something. It had taught her how to disappear inside her own body, how to move through a house full of people and be seen by none of them. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. Because this story, this one right here, it nearly broke me. And I need you to hear all of it. The cotton dress Sera wore had once been a soft, dusty blue. The kind of blue that reminded you of early morning sky, just before the sun fully rose. Now it was gray, a faded, washed-out gray that clung to her damp shoulders as sweat traced slowly down the curve of her spine. A loose strand of dark hair fell across her cheek. She did not push it away. There was no one in that room to notice. There never was. Cleaning girls were part of the furniture. They were expected to be present and invisible at the same time, and Sera had learned, the hard way, that this was simply the way things were. The bucket of soapy water beside her knee was warm and cloudy. She stared into it sometimes, just for a moment, just long enough to feel the sting behind her eyes before she blinked it away and kept going. But the work, as punishing as it was never the worst part of her day. The worst part was the quiet, because in the quiet, her mind went places she could not control. It went back to a porch in Cedar Hollow with wildflowers in a jar on the railing. It went back to a voice that once told her she was the only woman he would ever love. It went back to warm hands holding hers, promising her springtime and San Francisco and forever. His name was Cole Wentworth, and he had promised her the world before the world fell apart. That was before the drought came and dried up everything her family owned. Before the cattle died, one by one, like prayers going unanswered. Before she stood at 2 graves and dry, cracked earth with no one beside her and nowhere left to go. When the Laine family lost everything, Cole had stepped back, first slowly, like a man easing away from a fire that had grown too hot, and then completely. One day, he simply stopped coming. No letter, no goodbye, just silence, and then the news, carried to her by a girl in the market with apologetic eyes, that Cole Wentworth was now engaged to Delia Frome. Delia, with her family's money and her silk dresses and her father's land. And Sera had swallowed that news like broken glass and kept walking. Now she was a cleaning girl on her knees in someone else's grand house, and Cole was somewhere in Cedar Hollow, laughing. The ballroom doors creaked open. Sera did not look up. She assumed it was the housekeeper coming to check her work with that particular look of mild disappointment that seemed permanently fixed on the woman's face. But the footsteps were too light, too quick, too cheerful for that. There you are. The voice was warm and slightly breathless. I've been looking for you everywhere, Sera Laine. Sera sat back on her heels and looked up. Nola Reed stood in the doorway, her freckled face bright and flushed, her copper-red hair escaping from a loose braid in every direction. Her eyes were dancing with something that Sera had not seen aimed at her in a very long time. It took her a moment to name it. Hope. I'm working, Sera said, nodding toward the half-clean floor. You are always working, Nola said, stepping inside without invitation, her boots clicking against the wood Sera had just polished. Tonight, you stop. Sera frowned. Nola, there is a ball, Nola said, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. Right here in this very estate. Tonight. And you are coming with me. The stomach drop was immediate. I have nothing to wear. Nola smiled, so wide her freckles bunched together at the corners of her eyes, and she pulled a folded dress from behind her back like a woman who had been planning this for days. I brought you something. It is clean, it fits, and before you say another word, I am not taking it back. Sera stared at the dress. She stared at Nola. She looked back at her bucket of soapy water, at the half-scrubbed floor, at the worn brush in her raw hand. It was safer to stay here. It was safer to remain invisible. She had built something of a life out of smallness, and small things did not shatter. But there was something in Nola's expression that was not pity and was not sympathy. It was something older and more stubborn than either of those things. It was the kind of look that said, "You are still here, and still here means something, and I will not let you forget it." Sera put down the brush. 2 hours later, she stood in the cramped room she shared with 3 other housemates, facing a cracked mirror that hung crooked on the plaster wall. The dress Nola had brought was simple and dark, black with a modest collar, mended carefully at the hem in 2 places. But it fit her like it had been sewn for her body and no one else's. Her hair was pinned up in a soft arrangement that Nola had managed with impressive speed and several muttered prayers. A few dark strands had escaped around her face, and Nola had declared them perfect. Sera looked at the woman in the mirror for a long time. She barely knew her. "You look beautiful," Nola said softly from the doorway. Sera's throat tightened so sharply that she had to press her lips together for a moment before she could respond. She had not heard those words spoken to her, not genuinely, not without an edge of something beneath them, in longer than she could remember. Her mother used to say them. Her mother, who was gone. Her mother, who she missed every single morning when she woke in that narrow maid's bed and felt the whole weight of her life settle back onto her chest like a stone. She nodded once. She did not trust her voice just yet. Together they walked down the back staircase, through the narrow service corridors, past the smell of roasting meat drifting from the kitchen, and toward the warm golden glow that spilled under the ballroom doors at the end of the hall. Music reached them first, the sweet and slightly sorrowful pull of violins, a piano underneath it all like a heartbeat. Laughter floated through. The scent of bread and candle wax and perfume wound through the air. Lanterns burned in clusters along the walls, throwing soft amber light across the polished floors and the white tablecloths, and the glittering guests moving in slow, easy circles. For one brief, fragile moment, Sera forgot herself entirely. She forgot the bucket and the brush and the cracked mirror and the empty space where her old life used to be. She forgot all of it. And then she saw him. Cole Wentworth stood near the center of the room in a dark tailored suit that looked brand new. He was laughing at something one of the men beside him had said, his head thrown back, easy and open and entirely unburdened. Delia Frome was on his arm, radiant in pale green silk, her fingers light on his sleeve. She was beautiful. Sera had always known she was beautiful. That had never been the comfort people seemed to think it would be. Cole's eyes swept the room the way confident men's eyes always do, and they landed on Sera. He went very still. Then, slowly, deliberately, he detached himself from Delia's arm and crossed the room toward her. Sera did not move. She would not move. She had survived burying her parents in cracked earth. She had survived 6 months on her knees in other people's houses. She would survive this. "Well," Cole said, stopping in front of her with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Sera Laine, I heard you taking work here. I didn't quite believe it." He let his gaze travel over her slowly, and she felt it like a cold hand. "You should be grateful, you know. The Calloways are generous people. Not everyone would take on someone in your situation." He lowered his voice slightly. "After all, who exactly is lining up to take on a woman with nothing left to her name?" The heat that rushed into Sera's face was not embarrassment. It was something older, something that had been building for 6 months in the dark. She had survived hunger. She had survived grief. She had stood at fresh graves in the middle of a rainless summer with no one to hold her hand, and she had kept standing. And now this man, This man who had once held her hands and called her his whole world, stood before her wearing a new suit paid for by another woman's family and looked at her like she was something stuck to the bottom of his boot. Her eyes moved without her permission. They swept the room, searching for something she could not have named if she tried. And they found him. He stood at the far edge of the ballroom, one broad shoulder resting against a carved stone pillar, slightly apart from the crowd the way powerful men sometimes are, not excluded from it, but not quite needing it either. Tall, dark-haired, his sleeves were rolled at the cuff in a way that seemed less fashionable and more simply practical, as though he had been doing something real before he came in here. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, dark and steady, were resting on her face. Everett Calloway, the man who owned the estate, the man whose floor she scrubbed. Something shifted inside Sera so quickly and so completely that she almost lost her footing. She was moving before the thought had fully formed, crossing the ballroom floor with her heart slamming against her ribs, the music growing distant, the crowd blurring at the edges of her vision. People turned to look. She did not care. She could not stop. She crossed the whole length of that room, and she stopped in front of Everett Calloway, and she looked up into those dark, steady eyes, and then she grabbed the front of his coat with both hands, rose up on her toes, and kissed him. Hard, desperate, certain. For one single heartbeat, he went completely still, and then his hands found her waist, large and warm and sure, and he held her with a steadiness that felt like the ground itself. The world tilted sideways. The music fell away entirely. The whispers started. She could feel them beginning at the edges of the room, but they were very far away. She pulled back just far enough to breathe. Then she turned and found Cole's face across the room. She held her voice steady by sheer force of will. "He is my betrothed," she said, and the words carried. The ballroom went silent as a held breath. If you have ever been looked at like you were nothing by someone who once meant everything to you, stay with me. Because what happens next changed Sera's life forever. And I promise you, it is worth hearing. Sera's legs were barely holding her when Everett's hand moved to the small of her back, firm and quiet. "We need to talk," he said, close to her ear, his voice low enough that only she could hear. She nodded because she could not speak. They stepped through the French doors at the back of the ballroom onto the wide veranda, and the cool night air hit her like a wave. The sounds of the ball became muffled behind the heavy wooden doors. Somewhere beyond the darkened grounds, cattle lowed in the distance. A creek whispered under the stars. The prairie breathed slowly all around them, wide and dark and indifferent to the disaster Sera had just set in motion. She gripped the railing until her knuckles went white. Everett stood beside her, lantern light from the doorway cutting across the sharp angles of his face. He was not angry, exactly. He was something more careful than angry. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked quietly. "I wanted him to see," Sera said. Her voice was steadier than she deserved. "I wanted him to know that I am not invisible. You have done considerably more than that." Everett's voice was even, measured, but there was a weight behind it. "You tied yourself to me in front of every person in that room. That kiss does not disappear in the morning. People will expect a wedding. They will expect loyalty. They will watch." Sera swallowed. "I did not think." "No," he said simply. "You did not." She lifted her chin. "If I find I do not want the consequences." A faint, dry note entered his voice. "You will not have much choice. You claimed me, and I will not be made a fool in my own house." Her knees threatened to buckle, but she locked them and held his gaze. "I did it for revenge," she said. "Only for that." Everett studied her for a long moment. His eyes were unreadable but not unkind. "Do you believe that?" he asked. She opened her mouth, then closed it. "The moment you kissed me," he said quietly, "it stopped being about revenge. What you wanted was to feel what it is like to be seen, to belong somewhere again." The breath left her body so completely that for a moment she felt hollowed out. He was not wrong. "It felt powerful," she admitted, barely above a whisper. "Good," he said, "because you're going to need that." She looked at him, uncertain in a way she had not been in months, not even afraid, just open, like a door she had kept bolted for so long that the fresh air on the other side was almost too much to bear. "If the world believes you are mine," Everett said, and his voice was steady as the land around them, "then you must learn to stand like it. Walk into rooms without dropping your eyes. Speak without apologizing for taking up space." "I don't know how," she whispered. Something passed across his face that was not quite a smile and not quite sadness either. "I will teach you," he said. The wind moved through the tall grass beyond the veranda. The stars burned cold and bright above the Montana prairie. And Sera Laine stood at the edge of that wide, dark night and understood that she had just stepped off a cliff, and there was absolutely nothing beneath her feet. But she had stopped falling. Sera kissed a stranger to wound the man who broke her. She did not know that one desperate, reckless act was about to rewrite everything she believed about herself. But the morning after that ballroom, the real test began, and it was harder than anything she had ever faced. Part 2 is coming, and you will not want to miss what Everett Calloway asked her to do next. The morning after the ball, the Calloway estate felt different. Or perhaps Sera was the one who felt different, and the estate simply reflected it back at her the way still water reflects the sky. She woke before dawn, her heart already racing, the events of the previous night arriving in her chest before her eyes were fully open. The narrow maid's bed felt smaller than it ever had. The thin plaster walls pressed inward. She lay there in the gray pre-dawn quiet and wondered, seriously and for several long minutes, if she had lost her mind entirely. She had kissed Everett Calloway, in front of everyone, and told a room full of people he was her betrothed. She pressed both palms flat against her face and breathed. Then the whispers started. They moved through the corridors like smoke, soft and relentless, finding every crack and gap. She could not see the people saying these things, but she could hear them clearly enough. She claimed him right there in front of the whole gathering. Everett Calloway does not suffer games kindly. Who does she think she is? A cleaning girl, for heaven's sake. Sera sat up slowly. Her stomach was tight and cold. The fear was real. She could taste it at the back of her throat. But underneath it, so small it was almost nothing, there was something else. A spark. She had stood in the center of that ballroom and refused to be small. She had crossed that floor with her heart in her throat and done the one thing she had spent 6 months training herself never to do. She had been seen. She had taken up space. She had spoken in a voice that carried. And whatever the cost of it, she could not bring herself to wish it undone. She dressed carefully. She kept her shoulders back the way he had already, and that one quiet sentence on the veranda made her aware they usually were not. She walked down the corridor toward the kitchen with her chin level and her eyes forward. And when the cook looked up at her with open curiosity and the stable boy in the doorway stared, she did not look away first. That morning, a knock came at her door. Not the soft, apologetic tap of a fellow maid. Not the sharp, efficient rap of the housekeeper. This knock was measured and certain. She opened the door. Everett Calloway stood in the hallway in a dark work coat, dust from the yard still on his boots, his dark hair slightly wind-tousled. His expression was exactly as unreadable as it had been on the veranda. "Walk with me," he said. It was not a question. The Montana morning was enormous. The prairie stretched in every direction under a wide, pale sky, wind moving across it in long, slow waves that bent the grass and kept moving endlessly west. Cattle dotted the far hills. The air smelled of earth and cold water and something clean that she had almost forgotten existed. Everett stopped near the fence line and turned to face her. "You understand that men will test you now," he said. "They will watch for weakness. They will probe for the place where you flinch." "I'm not weak," Sera said too quickly. "I know," he said. And then, without unkindness, he added, "But you do not." She felt those words land somewhere deep. "Walk toward me," he said. She frowned. It seemed absurd. She was standing 10 feet from him in a field. But she walked. "Stop," he said. She stopped. "Your shoulders are curved inward. Your chin is tilted down. Your eyes go to the ground before they go to the person in front of you." He paused. "You are asking permission to exist in the space you are already standing in. Do it again." She wanted to argue. She swallowed it and walked again, this time consciously pulling her shoulders back, lifting her chin until the sky opened up above her properly. "Better," he said. But you're still bracing for something. You're still waiting to be turned away. Her jaw tightened. I've been turned away, she said. Repeatedly. By life in general. Something moved across his face. It was not sympathy. It was closer to recognition. I know, he said quietly, but you will not be turned away in my house. The days that followed became something she had not expected. They became lessons. In the library, he set ledgers in front of her, long columns of figures relating to cattle pricing, land holdings, supply agreements, water rights. His voice, as he explained it all, was patient and level, never once carrying the faint note of condescension that she had come to expect from men explaining things to women. He treated her mind the way he treated her, directly and without decoration. You must understand what you stand beside, he told her one afternoon, when her head was aching from an hour of trade route calculations. If people believe you're my intended, you need to know this ranch as well as I do. You cannot perform knowledge you do not possess. Her head throbbed. Her eyes were tired. She bent back over the ledger. In the empty ballroom, on 3 separate evenings, he taught her to dance. No crowd, no music at first, just their footsteps against the polished floor and the soft creak of the house around them. He placed one hand at her waist and held the other out, and she stepped directly onto his boot on the first attempt. He did not react. She tried again. Her body was rigid, fighting the movement, fighting him. You are not a piece of furniture. I am moving across a room, he said. Trust the direction. I don't trust easily, she replied. I noticed. There was no edge to it. Just the plain, quiet truth of it sitting between them like something they were both going to have to work around. Slowly, across those evenings, something in her body stopped resisting. Their steps began to align. The space between them felt different on those evenings than it did during the daylight hours, warmer somehow, charged with something she did not yet have a name for. When he finally had the housekeeper play the piano one evening while they practiced, Sera's heart beat faster in a way that had nothing to do with fear or revenge or any of the feelings she had cataloged and understood. It was something warmer, something she was not ready to look at directly. Right here, in the middle of these lessons, was where I realized that something had shifted in Sera that could never be shifted back. She had walked into that estate as a girl who believed she was invisible. She was slowly, painfully, beautifully becoming someone else entirely. Keep listening, because the next part of this story is the one that almost destroyed her. The horses came next. Everett brought her to the stables on a bright Tuesday morning, and the moment she stepped through the wide double doors and the smell hit her, hay and leather and warm animal, and something else she could not name, her breath caught so hard it made a sound. Her father had taught her to ride, before the drought, before the graves. He had lifted her onto a gray mare in a dusty paddock behind their house and told her to sit tall, that the horse could feel everything she was feeling, that fear and confidence both traveled right down through the reins. She had been 8 years old, and she had believed him completely. She had not been on a horse in 2 years. Everett held out the reins of a chestnut mare with a white blaze down her nose, watching Sera's face with that careful attention of his that she was beginning to recognize. You remember, he said simply. It was not a question. She nodded, even as her stomach tightened. The first few minutes in the saddle were awkward and stiff, her muscles uncertain, her confidence thin as paper. But then Everett said, from beside her on his own horse, "You are not a burden to this animal. You are part of the ride. Stop trying to take up less space than you need." She exhaled. She adjusted. She sat taller. They rode out across the prairie together, side by side, the wind pulling strands of hair loose from her pins and the land opening up around them in every direction, endless and wild and so beautiful that her chest ached with it. For the first time in 2 years, possibly longer, she felt the particular freedom that comes not from the absence of problems, but from the sudden impossible sense that your body belongs to you again, that you're strong enough to hold yourself upright, that the ground beneath you is solid and the sky above you is wide, and you are, still after everything, alive. She had not realized how badly she needed to feel that until it rushed through her all at once, warm as sunlight. She did not cry, but it was a near thing. Sera was learning to stand, to speak, to move through a room without flinching. She was slowly becoming someone she barely recognized, and it terrified her and thrilled her in equal measure. But just when the light was beginning to feel real, a letter arrived. And what was inside it broke something in Sera that she had not even known was still intact. Part 3 will make you weep. I promise you, it made me weep too. Peace, in Sera Laine's experience, was never a permanent condition. It was a visitor. It came in through a window, stayed long enough to make you believe in it, and then the door opened and it was gone. The letter arrived on an ordinary afternoon. The sky outside was still the uncomplicated blue of late summer. Everett was in the North Fields. Nola was in the kitchen. The house was quiet. One of the younger maids brought it to Sera's room with an expression that said she had already noted the rough quality of the paper, the uneven handwriting, the absence of any name in the return. Sera waited until the girl had gone. Then she unfolded it. It was 5 lines long. Your mother was not the woman you believed her to be. She made a choice during the drought that destroyed your family from the inside. She forged papers. She helped rival men take what was owed to your father. Your family's ruin was not misfortune. It was her doing. The words swam. Sera read them again and again. Her vision blurred. She sat down on the edge of the bed because her legs had simply stopped working. Her mother, Sera Laine, who had braided Sera's hair every morning until Sera was old enough to refuse it, and then missed it the moment she did. Clara, who sang while she kneaded bread dough, who stayed up through Sera's fevers placing cold cloths on her forehead, who had wept quietly the morning they buried the last of the cattle because she knew what it meant and was trying not to show the children how much she knew. Clara, who was buried now under dry ground in Cedar Hollow. How could these 2 women be the same person? How could the woman who had held her during every storm in her childhood have been the architect of the storm that took everything? That evening at dinner, the table felt enormous. Barrett Calloway, Everett's father, sat at the far end. He was a weathered man, not unkind but not warm, the kind of man who had made too many hard decisions over too many decades to waste expressions on things he considered settled. Sera waited until the food was half-eaten. She waited because she was afraid that if she asked too early, her voice would break before she reached the question. "Did you know my mother?" she asked. The room went very still. Barrett set his fork down slowly. He did not look at her immediately. When he did, his eyes were not cruel, but they were tired in the specific way of a man who has been carrying knowledge he would rather have been without. "I knew of her," he said at last. "She made difficult choices during the drought years. Helped certain men who should not have been helped. Your father, he never knew the full extent of it." He picked up his fork again, then set it back down. "I did not destroy your family, girl. But your mother's choices made what happened easier for others to accomplish." The room tilted. Sera pushed back her chair very carefully because she did not trust herself to do it roughly. She walked out of the dining room with her head up and her face composed, and she kept it composed all the way down the hallway, all the way to the library, and then she sat down in the chair by the cold fireplace, and the tears came so hard and so silently that her whole body shook with them. The letter was still in her hand. She did not remember carrying it. Her mother had braided her hair. Her mother had sung while making bread. Her mother had held her during storms. And her mother had set in motion the series of choices that ended with Sera on her knees in someone else's house, scrubbing someone else's floors, having buried them both in ground too dry and hard to receive them properly. How do you grieve someone twice? How do you mourn the person and then mourn the loss of the person you thought they were? How do you hold love and betrayal in the same 2 hands and not drop one of them? She did not hear Everett come in. She only became aware of him when he knelt on the floor in front of her chair, bringing his eyes level with hers. He did not speak immediately. He did not offer words of comfort before she was ready to receive them. He simply knelt there and waited. She looked at him through the blur of tears. "I am the daughter of a woman who destroyed her own family," she whispered. "I'm made from that. From her. You are the woman who crossed a ballroom full of witnesses and claimed me to survive," he said, and his voice was firm without being harsh. "You are not your mother's choices. But what if I carry her weakness?" The words tore out of her. "What if it is in me somewhere waiting? What if I am the kind of person who, under enough pressure, breaks in exactly the same direction she did?" Everett was quiet for a moment. You carry her strength, he said. You survived the loss of everything. You stood up from the floor of this house and refused to be nothing. That is not a weakness in you, Sera. That is the best version of her. The version she lost. You kept it. She tried to hold herself together. She genuinely tried. And then the sobs broke through all the way, and she pressed her face against her hands. And Everett Calloway put his arms around her and held her with the steady, patient solidity of a man who was not frightened by grief and did not need her to stop. She let herself come apart entirely. For the first time since the graves, for the first time since Cole, for the first time in 2 years of learning to be small and quiet and invisible, she let herself break. And in the wreckage, something strange and new and unexpected began to take root. Because revenge had brought her here. That was the truth. She had kissed this man out of desperation and wounded pride and the raw animal need to not be invisible in front of the man who had discarded her. But this, his arms around her in a cold library, his voice telling her that her mother's best self had survived in her, this was something else entirely. This was real. I want you to stop for just a moment. If you have ever loved someone and then discovered they were not entirely who you believed them to be, you know exactly the kind of pain Sera was carrying. The grief of losing a person and then grieving again the loss of who you thought they were. That grief is its own particular kind of lonely. If you know it, this story is for you. Keep listening. Sera had survived loss, humiliation, and now the shattering truth about her own mother. She was slowly becoming someone stronger. Something real was beginning to grow between her and Everett. And for the first time in 2 years, she was allowing herself to believe that life might still have something good in it. And then, on an ordinary afternoon on a quiet road, 3 men surrounded her horse. And everything almost ended before it had fully begun. Part 4 is next. Do not go anywhere. It was a Tuesday when they came for her. Sera had ridden out alone to visit her aunt, who lived in a small clapboard house a mile up the road from the Calloway estate near the creek bed. Her aunt was her last living family, a quiet woman with kind eyes and rough hands, who made strong tea and never asked questions that Sera was not ready to answer, and Sera visited when she could. The afternoon was bright and still. The road was empty. The grass on either side stood tall and golden. She was halfway back when she heard the hoofbeats behind her. At first she did not turn. Riders shared roads. There was nothing unusual about the sound of a horse on an open road in Montana in the afternoon. But then there were 3 of them, and they were not passing. They were spreading. One came up on her left side, one on her right. One dropped back slightly and then swung wide to block the road ahead. "Easy now," the one on her left said, and the smile on his face was the kind that has no warmth in it. Nobody wants trouble. Her heart went from steady to hammering so fast it made her dizzy. She tightened her grip on the reins. Her mare shifted beneath her, sensing what the riders could not quite hide. "We just want a word," the one on her right added. "We are having one," Sera said, and her voice was steadier than everything inside her. "Move off the road." The one ahead of her laughed quietly. She kicked her mare forward, and the man on her left grabbed the bridle. The mare reared, not high but enough, and Sera gripped with her knees the way her father had taught her, the way Everett had taught her again, and she did not fall, but she could not break free either, and she opened her mouth to do the only thing left to her. The shot rang out across the prairie like a crack in the sky. All 3 horses startled. The man holding her bridle let go. Everett came over the rise at a gallop, with 2 ranch hands flanking him, rifle across his saddle, his face wearing an expression that Sera had not seen on it before. She had seen him unreadable. She had seen him patient and firm and occasionally dry with something close to humor. She had not seen him like this. The 3 men looked at each other once. Then they turned and rode away without another word. Everett reached her in seconds. He was off his horse before it had fully stopped, crossing the last few feet on foot, and his hands came to her arms and his eyes went over her face with an intensity that made her chest hurt in a completely different way than fear. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. Her hands were trembling in a way she could not stop. He pulled her into his arms, and she felt his heart going as hard as hers, which for some reason made everything feel more real and more frightening, and also, somehow, more all right. His hold was not gentle. It was the hold of a man who had ridden hard and arrived, and was now not quite ready to release what he had arrived to protect. They were sent, he said into her hair. Those men do not ride that road by coincidence. She pulled back enough to look at him. Cole, we're a competing ranch. We're someone who does not like what they see happening here. His jaw was tight. It does not matter who sent them. What matters is that it will not happen again. She looked at him, at this man who had asked her to walk taller and sit straighter and trust the movement and learn the ledgers, who had held her while she wept over her mother and never once made her feel small for it. I won't let anyone come near you, he said, and his voice was quiet, but it was not a casual promise. It was the kind of thing a person says once. She leaned back into him and stayed there, and she did not apologize for it, and she did not brace against it, and she did not hold herself at a distance to avoid the possibility of losing it. She just held on. In the weeks that followed, something between them settled into a shape that had not previously existed. Sera moved out of the shared maid's room and into one of the rooms in the main house, by Everett's quiet arrangement, with no announcement and no particular fanfare. She sat beside him at the table when the ranch foreman came to discuss the fall cattle drive. She spoke when she had something to contribute, which was more often than she had expected, because she had spent months quietly absorbing everything he had placed in front of her. Men who had once glanced past her now paused to hear her finish a sentence. She learned the trade routes. She learned the water rights disputes that had been simmering between neighboring ranches for years. She learned which suppliers were reliable and which ones required watching and why, and what history sat behind the tension in certain handshakes. She was not being taught anymore. She realized one afternoon, sitting across from Everett with a contract spread between them. She was contributing. She was, in her own quiet way, leading. Cole Wentworth appeared at a town gathering in the second week of September. He stood across the open square with Delia on his arm, and Sera saw him see her, standing beside Everett while Everett spoke with the town magistrate. She saw Cole's jaw tighten. She saw the particular pride-wounded stillness that settled over him. She felt nothing she had not expected to feel, which was the sweetest, cleanest thing she had experienced in 2 years. Not triumph, not vindication, not even relief, just the quiet, settled recognition that the person across that square had no more claim on who she was. The summer heat began to break. September gold crept into the hills. The mountains in the distance turned that particular deep blue that comes just before the first snows. And somewhere between the ledgers and the dance lessons and the hard rides across the open prairie and the evenings that ran long, because neither of them had noticed the time, Sera understood something she had been circling for weeks. The anger toward Cole was gone. She had looked for it one evening and found its place empty, like a room cleared of furniture, cleaner for the absence, but strange and echoing. In its place was something quiet and steady and warm that she had not built consciously and could not have planned. She had stepped into the Calloway Ballroom for revenge. She was no longer interested in the past at all. Sera had survived humiliation, grief, her mother's hidden truth, and 3 men on a dark road. She had gone from scrubbing floors to sitting at the table where decisions were made. And somewhere along the way, without planning it, without allowing herself to believe it possible, she had fallen in love. But love is not love until it is spoken out loud. And what Everett Calloway was about to do in that frozen winter garden was going to change everything one final time. Part 5 is the last part, and it is the one that will stay with you. Winter came to Montana without apology. It arrived in the first week of November with frost that covered the prairie by morning, turning every blade of grass into something silver and fragile that crunched under boot heels. The wind carried a sharp, clean bite that slipped through coat, fabric, and settled deep in the chest. The mountains disappeared behind clouds for days at a time. The sky turned the color of pewter, and the cattle were brought in from the far fields, and the estate battened itself down with the practiced efficiency of a house that had weathered many winters. Fires burned in every hearth. Candles were lit earlier in the afternoons. The smell of the kitchen, always present, deepened into something richer, wood smoke and broth and bread, and the particular sweetness of dried fruit put up in the summer. Sera stood at the large window of the main hall on a Tuesday morning, her hand resting lightly on the glass, watching frost patterns form along the lower edge of the pane. She had been standing there for a while. She was not sure exactly how long. Her life had changed so completely and so quickly that she sometimes needed to stop moving entirely just to believe it was real. 6 months ago, she had been on her knees with a brush in her hand, invisible, grieving, convinced that the best parts of her life had already happened and been taken. And now she was standing in warm clothes in a warm house watching the frost and feeling, against all odds and all previous evidence, something that she could only call, carefully and quietly, peace. She heard Everett before she saw him. His footsteps were unhurried. He came to stand beside her at the window, and then his hands came over hers where it rested on the glass, warm against the cold. "You're thinking again," he said. "I am," she said. She turned slightly and looked at him, and whatever he saw in her face made something in his expression soften. "I never thought I would stand somewhere like this," she said. "Not like this. Not feeling like this." "You were always meant to stand somewhere like this," he said quietly. She made a small sound, something between a laugh and the edge of tears. "6 months ago, I was scrubbing your floors. And now," he said, "you know the floor plan, the land records, the supplier contracts, and the water rights disputes better than my foreman does." She pressed her hand more firmly against the glass, against his hands over hers. "I wanted revenge," she whispered, "when I walked across that ballroom. I wanted Cole to look at me and feel what I had been feeling. I wanted to wound him the way he had wounded me." She paused. "And now I don't think about him at all," she said. "I go entire days, and I don't think about him at all. And it does not feel like forgetting. It feels like he simply stopped being part of the story." Everett was quiet. "What fills his place," she said softly, "is stronger than what he left behind." 3 weeks later, under a pale winter sunrise that turned the frost-covered grass the color of rose gold, Everett found Sera in the garden at the back of the estate. She was standing near the old cottonwood tree at the edge of the property, her breath visible in the cold air, her face turned toward the light. The mountains were out that morning, sharp and white against the sky that had gone clear overnight. He walked toward her through the frozen garden with something in his hand. She turned when she heard him, and she saw his face before she saw what he was holding, and something in his face made her go very still. He stopped in front of her. He held out a ring. It was not elaborate. A plain gold band, clean and unadorned, the kind of thing that would last a lifetime without drawing attention to itself. "Marry me," he said, not as a strategy, not as a continuation of the arrangement. They had begun in a moment of desperation and mutual necessity. Not for show or for reputation or to maintain a story told in a ballroom 6 months ago. "Not for any of the reasons we started," he said. "For us. Because I want to wake up every morning and know that you are in this house. Because you make this place and this work and every conversation worth more than it was before. Because I love you, Sera Laine, and I want every single sunrise to be beside you." Her throat closed. She had spent so long believing that love was something belonging to other people, something she had briefly been allowed to borrow and then had rightfully returned, that she had quietly and without ceremony stopped waiting for it. And here it was, standing in a frost-covered garden in the cold morning light, offered in a plain gold ring by a man who had taught her to walk with her chin up, who had held her when she broke, who had ridden hard across open land to reach her when she needed reaching. She nodded, and the tears came, and she did not wipe them away, and she whispered, "Yes." His hands were warm when he placed the ring on her finger. They married beneath the cottonwood tree 2 weeks before Christmas, on a morning so cold that their breath made clouds when they spoke their vows. A small gathering stood witness, her aunt in the front with red-rimmed eyes and a straight, proud spine. Nola Reed cried openly and unapologetically from the moment the ceremony began until well after it ended, and laughed at herself for it, and did not stop crying. Everett wore a dark suit. Sera wore a cream dress that moved softly in the cold wind. When the words were spoken and the preacher went quiet, Everett kissed her with the particular care of a man who understood the weight of the moment and was not in any hurry to move past it. It was not the desperate, reckless, terrified kiss of a ballroom. It was something that had been built out of months of patience and honesty and the slow, deliberate work of becoming known to another person. It was a beginning, the real one. The years that followed were not without difficulty. Ranching in Montana in those years never was. There were hard winters and dry summers and disputes with neighboring landowners that required long hours and careful navigation. There were losses, animals and seasons, and one long, frightening stretch in the third year when a fever came through the region and they did not sleep properly for weeks. But Sera sat beside Everett in every meeting. She contributed, challenged, decided. Men who had once passed over her in a room now sought her opinion specifically because she had earned a reputation for reading people and situations with a directness that did not waste anyone's time. She was no longer being managed or shaped or taught. She was leading, and she knew it, and it fit her the way the black dress at the ball had fit her, as though it had always been hers, and she had simply not been in a position to claim it yet. When she told Everett she was carrying their first child, he went so still for a moment that she worried. And then he stood so quickly from a chair that it toppled backward on the floor, and he crossed the room in 4 long strides and held her with a fierceness that made her laugh against his shoulder. "A baby," he said, his voice rough in a way she had never heard from him. "We are having a baby." She could feel him breathing it in, the reality of it, the same way she had been breathing it in for days. Their daughter was born on a February night when the snow was coming down thick and the wind was pressing hard against the estate walls, and the house felt like the only warm thing in all of Montana. Everett held the infant in his large, careful hands with an expression that Sera had never seen on his face before and knew immediately she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. Something had opened in him that she had not known was closed. They named her Clara May, after a woman who had been flawed and lost and loved, and whose best self had survived in the daughter who outlasted her. Tell me in the comments. And if you've dealt with something similar, share your story. You're not alone. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life. 2 more children came in the years that followed. A boy named Run, quiet and thoughtful, who was most himself outdoors with his hands in the soil. A girl named Willa, bright-eyed and loud, and entirely confident in the way of a child who has never been made to doubt that she belongs where she stands. The estate filled with noise in the best possible way. Small boots on staircases. Books left open on chairs. The particular laughter of children who have been told, by example more than by word, that they are safe. Sera taught them to ride. She read to them by lantern light in the evenings. She told them, not once in a grand speech, but again and again in 100 small moments, that they were allowed to take up as much space as they needed. Everett taught them that courage was not the absence of fear, that a person's word, once given, was the most valuable thing they possessed, that land and cattle and money could all be lost and rebuilt, but character, once surrendered, was much harder to recover. On a warm evening in the early autumn of the 5th year, Sera found Everett in the barn, tending to a mare who was close to foaling, lantern light moving softly across his face and hands. She stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment without speaking. He knew she was there. "You're staring," he said, without looking up. "I'm remembering," she said. He looked up then. "The ballroom," she said. She stepped inside, breathing in the familiar smell of hay and horses and the particular warmth of a working barn at night. "I thought I was using you. I thought it was only revenge, and I was willing to carry the consequences of it, because anything was better than being nothing." She crossed to where he stood and placed her palms flat against his chest. "Now I know it was the bravest thing I have ever done," she said. "And I did not even know I was being brave. I was just desperate enough to stop being afraid for 1 single minute." He covered her hands with his. "You were furious," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "You were magnificent," he said. She laughed softly, and the laugh held every good thing that had happened in the 5 years since a girl in a borrowed black dress had walked across a ballroom floor and refused to be invisible. Outside, the autumn stars were coming out over the Montana prairie, the same enormous sky that had burned down on her when she was on her knees with a brush in her hand, believing that the best of her life was behind her. The grass moved in long, slow waves in the evening wind. The mountains stood dark against the last of the light. Sera rested her head against Everett's chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady as the land around them. I used to believe, she thought, that love was something promised, something offered in pretty words on a porch with wildflowers in a jar, something that could be given and then taken away when the circumstances changed, when the drought came and the cattle died and the name became worthless. Now I know it is something different entirely. It is something chosen. Every morning, in the small, ordinary choices of a day. Every time you could withhold yourself and you do not. Every time you could look away from someone and you look at them instead. She had walked into the Calloway estate as a cleaning girl with broken hands and a heart full of grief and a plan that was no plan at all, only desperation wearing the costume of defiance. She had kissed a stranger in a ballroom to wound someone else, and that reckless, trembling, impossible act had not destroyed her. It had brought her home. Some loves begin in anger. Some begin in grief. Some begin in a moment so desperate and so unlikely that you could not have planned it even if you had tried for years. And sometimes the boldest step a woman takes in the very worst moment of her life is the step that leads her somewhere she could never have imagined standing. Sera Laine had scrubbed those floors. Now she stood on them. And the difference between the girl who had arrived and the woman who remained was not luck. It was not circumstance. It was not the man beside her, though he was part of it. It was every moment she had chosen, despite everything, to stay standing. Love had not been her revenge. Love had been her reward. And now I ask you, truly, from the deepest part of this story, have you ever done something desperate that changed your life in ways you never expected? Have you ever stood in your worst moment and found that it somehow led you somewhere better? Tell me in the comments. And if you've dealt with something similar, share your story. You are not alone. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life.